$40,000 in cash. No name, no address, no one watching. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have told themselves it was fate, a gift, the universe balancing some old debt. Most people would have counted that money, gone home, and slept just fine. Ethan Carter was not most people. He had a daughter to raise, a mortgage 2 months behind, and a truck with a check engine light that had been on since January. He had every reason in the world to keep that money. He ran after a stranger instead. And that single choice cost him everything, and gave him something he never expected to find again. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The coffee was already cold by the time Ethan noticed the clutch on the bench. He hadn't planned on sitting down. He'd only stopped at the Burlington Farmers Market because Lily had begged him for the last 3 Saturdays. And 3 Saturdays of that particular brand of 10-year-old persistence was a threshold no reasonable adult could survive. She'd dragged him through half the stalls already, pressed her nose against a jar of raw honey like it was a museum exhibit, asked the goat cheese vendor a series of genuinely uncomfortable questions about goats. And when Ethan's back started talking to him the way it always did after a long week on his feet, he'd eased himself onto a wooden bench near the end of the row and told her she had 5 minutes to find whatever she was looking for. She was 17 stalls away, interrogating an elderly man about heirloom tomatoes. Ethan wrapped both hands around his paper cup and let his eyes close for just a second. The morning was cool for late May, the air still carrying that wet earth smell that Vermont held on to long after spring officially arrived. He could hear Lily laughing at something. That bright, unself-conscious laugh she had no idea she'd inherited from her mother. And for a moment he just sat inside that sound and let himself be still. When he opened his eyes, the bench beside him held a clutch he hadn't seen anyone set down. It was small, expensive looking, black leather with a silver clasp, the kind of thing that cost more than Ethan made in 2 weeks at the clinic. He looked both directions along the market aisle. The crowd moved in that lazy Saturday way. Strollers, canvas bags, a man with a corgi on a red leash. But no one was moving fast enough to suggest they'd just left something behind. He picked it up, turned it over. No tag. No identifying mark on the outside. He opened it. The money was bundled in neat stacks. Not loose bills, not emergency cash someone had tucked in a side pocket. Actual banded stacks of hundreds. The kind that came from a bank or a safe. He counted 4 of them before his brain caught up with what his hands were doing and made him stop. $40,000. He sat with that for a moment. The goat cheese vendor laughed at something a customer said. A child somewhere nearby dropped an ice cream cone and immediately began the kind of crying that only a dropped ice cream cone can produce. Ethan closed the clutch. He stood up and started looking. There. He spotted her about 60 meters down the main aisle, moving fast in the direction of the parking lot. She was wearing a dark blazer over a silk blouse, dressed the way people dressed when they'd come from somewhere or were going somewhere. Not the way people dressed for a Saturday morning farmer's market. She had dark hair pulled back and she was holding her phone to her ear, and she was walking with the kind of purpose that said, "I realize I've lost something and I am not handling it particularly well." Ethan called out. She didn't hear him. He called again, louder, and a woman with a stroller turned to look at him with mild alarm. He started jogging. His back protested this decision immediately. He ignored it. "Hey, excuse me, ma'am." She stopped and turned, and he got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, maybe 30, sharp features, the kind of composure that looked practiced, and eyes that did a rapid, unconscious assessment of him in the half-second before she spoke, cataloging him. He recognized the way people who lived in a certain world learned to catalog strangers. "Can I help you?" she said, and the politeness was there, but so was the wariness. Ethan held up the clutch. "You left this on the bench back there." Something crossed her face. Not just relief, something more physical than that. Something that loosened her shoulders and her jaw at the same time, like a cable that had been pulled tight had just been cut. "Oh my!" She took a single step toward him, stopped herself. "That's mine." "Yes, I can't believe I—" She reached for it and then paused with her hand in the air, not quite taking it. "Did you open it?" "I did," Ethan said. "I was looking for ID." She looked at him steadily. And? And I figured you'd want it back. She took the clutch from him. She opened it, checked the contents. He watched her do it without any particular expression, and she seemed to notice that because when she looked up, there was something different in her face. Less assessment, more attention. It's all there, he said. I can see that. She closed the clasp. Thank you. That was remarkably... She stopped, tried again. Most people wouldn't have. Yeah, well, he shrugged. It wasn't my money. She studied him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she opened the clutch again and reached inside, and he knew immediately what she was doing. Please don't, he said. Her hand stilled. I'd like to give you something for... I know, it's a nice thought. He meant it without the edge. I'm good, though. It's $40,000. I'm aware of what it is. And you don't want anything. I don't want your money. No. She seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond to this, which told him it didn't happen to her often. Maybe never. She was quiet for a beat, and then she said, Can I at least ask your name? Ethan Carter. Victoria Sterling. She offered her hand. Her grip was firm and direct. You live in Burlington? Outside it. Small town called Millhaven, about 20 miles north. Well, Ethan Carter from Millhaven. She held his gaze a beat longer than strictly necessary. You're a hard man to repay. I didn't do anything worth repaying, he said. Have a good morning, Ms. Sterling. He walked back to find Lily, who had moved on from the tomatoes and was now deep in conversation with a woman selling handmade soap. And Ethan stood beside his daughter and watched the market move around them. And he didn't think much more about it. He had no way of knowing he'd just made the most consequential decision of his life. The drive back to Millhaven took 23 minutes on a good day, and 30 on a day when Lily wanted to talk through every thought she'd had since waking up. That Saturday was a 30-minute drive. The tomato man said there's 600 varieties of heirloom tomatoes. Lily reported from the back seat, her feet on the seat beside her, in the particular boneless way of children. 600, Dad. Did you know that? I didn't. He let me try 3. The yellow one tasted like... She considered this carefully. Like a normal tomato, but politer, somehow. Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She had her mother's nose and her mother's habit of describing things in ways that made no sense but made you think anyway. Politer. Yeah, like it was trying not to overwhelm you. He smiled at the road. How was the goat cheese guy? He was great. He said goats are actually very emotionally complex. He's right. He said they can recognize human faces and remember them for years. Also true. Lily was quiet for a moment, which usually meant she was loading something. Then, who was that lady? The one you ran to? She forgot her bag. You ran pretty fast. I jog sometimes. Dad. The tone of a 10-year-old who has seen through you effortlessly and wants you to know it. You always say your back hurts. It did hurt. I jogged anyway. She accepted this because she was, at her core, a practical person. Was she nice? Ethan thought about the way Victoria Sterling had looked at him. That quick assessment, then the longer something else. She was polite, he said. That's different from nice. It is, he agreed. Millhaven appeared around a curve of 2-lane road the way small Vermont towns did, gradually, without announcement. A gas station. The hardware store that had been there longer than anyone in town could remember. The white steeple of the town hall visible above the tree line, and then the town itself. A grid of streets that anyone could walk end to end in 20 minutes. Ethan had grown up 40 miles from here. He'd left at 18 for college, then medical school, then the army, and had covered more of the world in the years that followed than most people see in a lifetime. He'd operated in field hospitals in conditions that people who hadn't been there simply could not picture. He'd held lives together with his hands under circumstances that removed any illusion that the world was organized or fair. He'd come back to Vermont because his wife was dying and she'd wanted to die somewhere that felt like home. And he'd stayed because Lily needed roots and he didn't have anywhere better to be. And that had been 4 years ago, and most days he told himself it was enough. Some days he believed it. The house was a 3-bedroom colonial on the edge of town, 3 acres of land and a lake view that was the only expensive thing about it. He'd bought it during the last year of Sarah's life. stretched himself to worked at a community health clinic in Burlington, 3 days a week as a physician, the kind of general practice work that was about as far from trauma surgery as medicine could get. He did it because it needed doing and because the hours allowed him to pick Lily up from school most days. There were things he missed about surgery, the precision of it, the problem-solving clarity when the world narrowed to the space between your hands and the thing that needed fixing, and nothing else existed. But surgery at the level he'd done it required more of a person than he currently had to give, and he'd made his peace with that, or at least a working truce. He pulled into the driveway. Lily was out of the car before he'd fully stopped. "Can I take my bike to Maisie's? After lunch. Can lunch be fast?" "Lunch can be efficient." She considered this. "Okay." Monday was a clinic day. He saw 17 patients between 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. A retired teacher with a knee that needed more than he could offer her at the clinic. A young man who'd driven 40 minutes to see a doctor because he didn't have a regular one anywhere closer and had been hoping the chest tightness he'd been ignoring for 3 months would go away on its own. It had not. Ethan spent an hour with him, ordered tests, called a colleague in cardiology, and by the time the young man left, he was scared, but he knew what was happening to him and what needed to happen next, which was considerably better than the alternative. Between patients, Ethan sat at his desk and ate a sandwich and did not think about $40,000 in a stranger's clutch. It wasn't difficult. He'd returned things before. A wallet once, left in a grocery cart with $200 inside. A phone. A set of car keys that had taken him 45 minutes of asking around to reunite with their owner. He didn't think of these things as particularly notable. You found something that belonged to someone else, you gave it back. The equation was that simple. The fact that the arithmetic of his own bank account made it feel less simple didn't change what was right. What stayed with him, faintly, was not the money, but the look on her face. Not the relief. That was expected. The look that came after the relief. The one he hadn't been able to name precisely. Like she'd been handed something unfamiliar and was trying to figure out what to do with it. He let it go. He had an afternoon full of patients and a daughter who needed dinner and a leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom that he'd been meaning to address since March. He drove home. He picked Lily up from school. He made pasta, which she ate while describing a conflict within her friend group with the seriousness of a UN mediator. He fixed the faucet. He read for an hour after she went to bed. He did not think about Victoria Sterling again until Wednesday, when she walked into his clinic. Thus, he came out of an exam room to find her sitting in the waiting room, and his first thought was that she was ill, and his second thought, following immediately behind the first, was that she had not made an appointment. She was wearing different clothes, jeans and a plain gray sweater, a deliberate step down from Saturday's blazer, and he recognized the effort in that. The way people sometimes dressed to seem less like themselves when they were trying to do something that required a different version of themselves. She stood up when she saw him. "I should have called," she said. "The receptionist would have told you I'm booked." "I know. That's why I didn't call." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back, steady, waiting for him to be annoyed or to ask her to leave, and he could see she'd prepared for that, had an argument ready, and he decided to deprive her of the opportunity. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. "I have a patient." He went back inside. When he came out 12 minutes later, she was still there, sitting with her hands in her lap, not looking at her phone, which in Ethan's experience was something almost no one did in a waiting room anymore. He led her back to his office, which was small and overfull with files and a plant that Lily had given him on Father's Day and that he had managed despite everything to keep alive. "How did you know where I worked?" he asked, sitting behind his desk. "I have resources." She sat across from him and seemed to register his expression. "That sounds worse than it is. You told me your name. I was curious." "You ran a search on me." "I verified what you'd told me, yes." "Is that a habit of yours?" "I run a foundation with $200 million in annual disbursements," she said. "It's a professional practice. I should have told you instead of just—" She stopped. "I'm not particularly good at this." "What?" "At not seeming like someone who looks people up without telling them." Despite himself, Ethan almost smiled. "Why are you here, Ms. Sterling?" "Victoria." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about what you did. Since Saturday. Returning your bag. Returning my bag without taking anything from it and refusing to let me compensate you for it. She said it without the warmth people sometimes use to frame a compliment, said it like a fact she was trying to get clear in her mind. I meet a lot of people in my work, people who present a version of themselves, a particular face, because I have something they want, and I've gotten reasonably good at identifying that gap between the face someone shows you and what's actually operating underneath it. And I couldn't find a gap with you. She paused. I still can't. Ethan looked at her. There was something uncomfortable about this, being analyzed this directly. But there was also something honest about it, a way of saying the true thing instead of the easier version that he couldn't help but respect. I appreciate that, he said, but it doesn't explain what you're doing in my waiting room. I wanted to ask if I could take you to lunch. She said it simply, not as a reward, as an acknowledgement that I handled Saturday badly and I'd like to, do it differently. You handled Saturday fine. I was dismissive. You were cautious. That's not the same thing. She seemed to process this. Then, lunch is still the request. He had 7 more patients that afternoon, and a teleconference at 3 and a parent-teacher meeting at 5:30. He was aware of all of these things while also being aware that the woman sitting across from him was looking at him with the particular directness of someone who didn't waste time on conversations they didn't mean to have. Thursday, he said. I have a break between 12 and 1:30. She nodded. Thursday. The restaurant was her suggestion, a place in Burlington that Ethan had driven past 100 times without going inside, the kind of establishment where the menu was short and the prices were long. He almost pushed back on it, but something made him let her choose. She arrived before him, which he noticed, and she was sitting at a corner table with her phone face down, which he also noticed. They ordered. The food was excellent, and neither of them paid much attention to it. He'd expected her to be the one doing the talking, but she asked him questions, real ones, not the getting-to-know-you inventory people exchanged at first meetings. She asked what had drawn him to medicine. She asked what the Army had been like. She asked about the gap between trauma surgery and the community clinic in a way that said she'd already figured out there was a gap and was curious about what had bridged it. He found himself answering honestly. About medical school at 22, the way the operating room had felt like a place where everything chaotic in him became quiet and focused. About the Army's surgical program, the field hospitals, the particular weight of working in conditions that stripped every procedural comfort away and left you with just your hands and what you knew. About coming home. He didn't offer Sarah's name, but he said my wife was sick and Victoria didn't push further, and he was grateful for that. She told him about the foundation, about starting it at 26 with her own money, and what it was like to turn a personal asset into something institutional, something with its own momentum and logic. About the ways it had grown into something larger than her original idea, and the ways that growth had introduced complications she hadn't anticipated. She said the word complications with something compressed inside it. He filed that away without commenting. You have a daughter, she said. 10 years old, her name's Lily. How long have you been doing it alone? 4 years. She was quiet for a moment. That's a long time. It's the only way I know how to do it at this point. He meant it practically, not dramatically. Is she why you came back to Vermont? She's part of why I stayed. He moved his fork across his plate. Her mother wanted to be somewhere that felt like home at the end. Vermont was that. And after, it didn't seem right to uproot Lily again. She'd already had enough disruption. He paused. Also, she knows everyone in Millhaven and half of them feed her, so it's a logistically sound arrangement. Victoria smiled. It was different from the composed expression she'd been wearing, looser, quicker, gone before it quite finished. She sounds remarkable. She's extraordinarily opinionated for a person who's been alive 10 years. The best ones usually are. They split the check. She didn't make a production of it or let him argue, just split it cleanly down the middle the way someone did when they understood that not everything needed to be a gesture. He appreciated that. Outside the restaurant on the sidewalk, she said, I'm glad you came. I almost didn't. Why did you? He considered the actual answer, which was that she had looked at him across his cluttered office desk with an expression of complete directness and said, "I wanted to ask if I could take you to lunch," and that he had not, in a long time, been asked for his time by someone who made it sound that simple. But he didn't say any of that. "I was curious," he said. She nodded, and there was something in her face that looked almost like understanding. "Fair enough." He drove back to the clinic. He sat at his desk between patients and stared at the wall for a minute longer than usual, thinking about nothing specific, and then he picked up the next chart and went back to work. The phone calls started the following week. The first one came on a Tuesday evening. Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table, and Ethan was at the counter chopping vegetables, and his phone buzzed with an unknown number. And when he answered, there was a pause before a voice said, "Is this the doctor who found the woman's bag last weekend?" "Who is this?" Ethan said. Another pause. Then the line went dead. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment, set it on the counter, went back to chopping. The second call came Thursday afternoon, different number, same silence before the caller disconnected. He told himself it was nothing. Spam, robocalls, the modern plague. He didn't yet have a reason to think otherwise. The thing about living alone with a 10-year-old was that the texture of daily life became its own kind of structure, and structure was not nothing. Monday was clinic. Tuesday was Lily's swim practice. Wednesday, he worked from home, doing chart notes and telehealth calls. Thursday was clinic again. Friday was the one night he cooked a real dinner instead of the weeknight pragmatism of pasta or scrambled eggs or the breakfast for dinner option that Lily always voted for with enormous enthusiasm. He built his life around these rhythms, the way once he had built it around the demands of a different life. Surgeries, deployments, the constant forward motion of a career that operated at the edge of what a person could give. The rhythms were quieter now. The stakes were smaller in the technical sense, though Lily would have argued this. Everything about Lily was a high stake: her math grade, the dynamics of her friend group, the question of whether the family next door's Labrador puppy constituted a moral imperative to get a dog of their own. "It's lonely," she'd told him 3 weeks ago, lying upside down on the living room couch with her hair hanging toward the floor, the particular posture of a child making a philosophical argument. The puppy is lonely. The puppy has 3 humans and a yard. Emotionally lonely. Lily. Goats can recognize faces. Dogs can too. We're not getting a dog. I'm just saying it's something to think about. He thought about it. He did not get a dog, but he thought about it, which she had intended. On a Friday evening in the second week of June, Victoria called him from her actual number. He recognized it because she'd texted him after their lunch with a brief, "Thanks for today." He'd responded with likewise. He was aware this was a minimal exchange. "I want to ask you something," she said when he picked up. Her voice had a different quality than in person, quieter, like she'd taken something off. "Okay. Have you received any strange calls recently? Numbers you don't recognize, no one speaking?" Ethan set down the book he'd been reading. 2, a week ago." Silence. Then, "I thought it might just be me." "What's happening?" She paused long enough that he could hear the quality of it. A considered pause, not a careless one. "I'm not entirely sure yet. There's some financial irregularity at the foundation. I've been looking into it. I'm probably being overcautious about connecting things." "Are you safe?" "Yes." Too quick. Then, "I think so." He looked across the room at the stack of Lily's books on the coffee table, her backpack hanging off the chair, the ordinary geography of their home. "You should talk to someone official about the financial thing," he said. "I'm aware of that." "But you're not ready to." Another pause. "I need to understand what I'm looking at first, before I take it anywhere. If I move too early and I'm wrong..." She stopped. "There are people inside the foundation whose careers depend on its reputation. I need to be sure." "That's a reasonable position." "It's a frightening one." He said, "Yeah," because it was. She was quiet a moment, then, "How's Lily?" He let the shift happen because she needed to. "She's lobbying me for a dog." "What's her argument?" "Emotional loneliness of a neighbor's Labrador." That's actually a solid argument. Don't encourage her. I'm just saying emotionally lonely dogs are a real issue. I'm ending this call. She laughed, brief and genuine, and then they said goodnight, and he set the phone down and sat in the quiet of his house for a long time, listening to Lily moving around upstairs getting ready for bed, the ordinary sounds of his ordinary life, and trying to remember if anything had changed. Something had changed. He could feel the shape of it, even if he couldn't name it yet. Not the calls, not the vague mention of financial irregularity, not even the specific fact of Victoria Sterling and the unlikely thread of connection that had run from a bench at a farmer's market to 2 lunch hours to a phone conversation on a Friday night. It was something underneath all of those things, a shift in the air pressure of his life, the way you could feel a storm changing the sky before you could see any clouds. He'd spent years operating in conditions that had trained him to recognize that feeling, to take it seriously, to not talk himself out of it when everything visible looked fine. He sat with it for a while. Then he checked the locks on the doors, something he didn't normally do, and went upstairs. Lily was already asleep. He stood in her doorway for a moment, looking at his daughter in the blue-gray light, her hair fanned across the pillow, one arm hanging off the edge of the bed at an angle that made him think her shoulder was going to ache in the morning. He thought about what it meant to protect something, the different textures of that, the way it had meant one thing in an operating room and something else entirely standing in a doorway watching a child sleep. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him. Outside, the Vermont night was quiet. The lake was still. Nothing moved in the darkness beyond the window except the tree branches, stirring in a wind that had just come up, rattling the glass once before falling still again. He told himself it was nothing. He didn't sleep particularly well. The calls stopped. That was the first thing Ethan noticed, and he wasn't sure whether to find it reassuring. In his experience, things that stopped abruptly didn't always stop. Sometimes they just went quiet while they figured out a different approach. He kept that thought to himself. There was no one useful to say it to, and saying things out loud had a way of making them more real before you had enough information to know what you were actually dealing with. The second week of June moved through its routines, clinic days, school pickup, a Thursday evening when the neighbor's Labrador escaped its yard and ended up on Ethan's porch, and Lily appeared from nowhere with the energy of a person whose prayers had been answered, and Ethan spent 20 minutes on the phone with the neighbors while his daughter sat on the porch steps feeding the dog crackers and having what appeared to be a serious conversation with it. "She's very emotionally available," Lily reported when the owners came to collect the dog. "The dog?" "Yes, she really listens." "Dogs can't listen, Lily. They respond to tone." "That's literally what listening is, Dad." He didn't have a great response to that. Victoria texted him on a Wednesday, not a call, a text, which he'd noticed she used when she had something specific to say and didn't want it to turn into a conversation. "I found another account, different shell company, same pattern. I'm going to need someone to talk to about this who isn't connected to the foundation. Is Friday still okay for you?" He stared at the message for a moment. They hadn't made plans for Friday. She was asking if it could be a thing without framing it as asking. He typed back, "Friday works. Same place?" Her response came 30 seconds later. "Somewhere quieter. I'll find something." She chose a place on the edge of Burlington, small, off the main streets, the kind of restaurant that didn't have a sign visible from the road and that Ethan would never have found on his own. He arrived first this time, which seemed to matter to her when she walked in and saw him already seated. Something in her posture settled. She sat down and didn't look at the menu. "How bad is it?" he asked. She pressed her fingers flat against the table. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but he'd spent years reading people's bodies for information they weren't volunteering. "Bad enough that I've been running the numbers 3 different ways, hoping I'd find an error." "How long has it been going on?" "Best I can tell, 2 years, maybe longer." She exhaled slowly. The structure is sophisticated. Whoever set it up knew exactly how the foundation's accounting worked, which reporting lines to use, which disbursement channels had the least oversight. It reads like a grant on paper. 12 different grants, actually, to 12 different organizations that don't meaningfully exist. Shell companies, every one of them. And the money goes where? That's the part I can't trace yet. It moves through 3 or 4 layers, and then it did him with an expression that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with not sleeping enough. The kind of tired that came from trusting the wrong person for a long time. The accounts were set up by my CFO, Marcus Webb. He's been with the foundation since I started it. Ethan said nothing. He waited. He's not just an employee, she said. He was one of the first people who believed in what I was trying to build. He helped me structure the whole thing. She pressed her fingers against the table again. I've had dinner at his house. His kids call me by my first name. How sure are you? Sure enough that I didn't sleep well for 5 days after I found it. She met his eyes. The digital trail has his authorization on every single transaction. He could argue he was deceived, that someone forged the authorizations. I know, that's what makes this. I keep trying to find the version where that's true. She looked down at the table. I can't find it. Ethan turned his water glass slowly in his hands. Why are you telling me this? She looked up. Because you haven't given me a reason not to. It was a strange answer, and also, he thought, an honest one. He'd met enough people who orbited wealth to know the particular loneliness it produced, the way everyone in that orbit had something to gain, which made genuine confidence in anyone's motives a complicated calculation. He'd seen it in the way she'd looked at him at the farmer's market, the assessment, the gap she'd been looking for. You need to go to the FBI, he said, or at minimum a forensic accountant who can document the chain before anyone has a chance to cover it. I know, but if I move before I have the full picture and Marcus finds out, she stopped. He has relationships inside this foundation that I don't fully understand. Donors, board members. If he has enough warning, he can move the money and make it look like I'm the one who fabricated evidence. She shook her head. I need 2 more weeks, maybe 3. That's a long time to be sitting on this alone. I'm not alone, she said. And then she seemed to realize what she'd said and looked slightly away. He didn't comment on it. He said, Is there anyone inside the foundation you trust completely? Not trust probably, completely. She thought about it. My director of communications, a woman named Diane. She's been with me since the beginning, and she's not in any financial chain I've found. Talk to her. Don't tell her everything, but have someone on the inside who knows something is wrong. He paused. If something happens to you, someone needs to know where to look. Victoria looked at him steadily. You're taking this more seriously than I expected. You should be taking it more seriously than you are. I'm terrified, she said flatly. Is that serious enough? Then act terrified. Terrified people tell someone. She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant was filling up around them, the low hum of Friday evening conversations. I'll talk to Diane, she said finally. This week. Good. They ordered. The conversation shifted, deliberately on her part, he thought. A deliberate change of pressure. She asked about his clinic work, and he talked about it in the way he normally didn't. The actual shape of the days, the particular satisfaction of a kind of medicine that was less dramatic than surgery, but that touched more lives in a quieter way. She listened the way she had at their first lunch, completely, without the performance of listening, without the visible effort of waiting for her turn. It was a quality he associated with people who'd had to learn somewhere that information was valuable and worth paying real attention to. You could go back to surgery, she said, if you wanted. I know. But you don't want. He considered the honest answer. I'm not sure I trust my hands the way I used to. 4 years is a long time away from an OR. Your hands are the same. It's not really about the hands. She nodded slowly. He could see her deciding whether to push further and then deciding not to. He appreciated the decision. Lily asked about you, he said, which surprised him slightly as he said it, because he hadn't planned to mention it. Victoria looked up. She knows about me? I mentioned I'd had lunch with someone I'd met at the market. She asked if it was the lady from the bag. What did she say? She asked if you were nice or just polite. He paused. She makes that distinction. What did you tell her? That I wasn't completely sure yet. Victoria considered this for a moment, and then said, That seems accurate. Ma. He drove home through the Vermont evening, the fields going gold on either side of the road, and he found himself doing something he hadn't done in a while, just letting his mind move without trying to direct it. Not processing, not planning, just following the current of whatever was running underneath the ordinary thoughts. He didn't know what to do with Victoria Sterling, not in any sense that he could make simple. She was a person in potential danger who was choosing, for understandable reasons, not to move as quickly as she should, and he understood that and found it frustrating in equal measure. She was also a person who looked at him without any of the layers people usually maintained in early acquaintance, which was either entirely genuine or a very sophisticated performance. And the fact that he couldn't be completely certain which troubled him less than it probably should have. He'd liked her. He'd liked her at the farmer's market and at the first lunch and on the phone and at dinner tonight, and he was aware that liking someone and being right about them were not the same thing. He turned into his driveway. The porch light was on. Through the front window he could see the lamp in the living room, and he knew Lily was in there with the babysitter, probably making a case for staying up late. He sat in the truck for a minute before going inside. The night was clear and cool, stars beginning to show above the tree line. Very quiet. Very still. He thought about the calls that had stopped, and about the phrase shell companies, and about the expression on Victoria's face when she'd said Marcus Webb has been with me since I started it. Then he got out of the truck and went inside to pay the babysitter and get his daughter to bed. The following Tuesday, he ran into her unexpectedly. He was at the hardware store in Burlington, a longer drive than the Millhaven option, but they carried a specific pipe fitting he needed, and he was standing in the plumbing aisle doing the mental arithmetic of a repair that was going to be more complicated than he'd hoped, and he heard his name. Victoria was at the end of the aisle holding a bag and looking at him with an expression of mild surprise, like she'd been caught doing something ordinary. "Hardware store," he said. "I have a building," she said. "Buildings have things that break." "Fair enough." She walked down the aisle and looked at the parts in his hand. "What are you fixing?" The pipe under the bathroom sink decided to give up. "Can't you call someone?" "I am someone." She almost smiled. "Right, the surgeon thing. Plumbing and surgery have more in common than people think." He turned the fitting over. "You're dealing with pressure differentials, flow rates, the consequences of a leak in the wrong place. Now I'm going to think about that every time I'm in an OR. You spend time in operating rooms? The foundation funds a pediatric surgery program. I visit twice a year." She paused. "It's the part of the work I find hardest to be in the room for. Watching someone cut into a child and knowing the whole thing depends on whoever is holding the instruments not making one wrong move. It's not as terrifying from the inside," he said. "From the inside, you're just solving a problem." She looked at him. "Do you miss it?" Actually. He'd been asked this before, by colleagues, by the few people in Millhaven who knew his history. He'd always given a version of the same answer, which was something like sometimes, or it served its purpose, or the most common deflection, a subject change so smooth the person asking rarely noticed. He said, "Some days more than others." She heard something different in that, he could tell, and she let it land without covering it with a follow-up question. Just nodded once, slowly, like she was filing it where it belonged. "Have you talked to Diane?" he asked. "Yesterday." She adjusted the bag on her arm. "She didn't say much when I told her what I'd found. She just went very quiet, and then she said, 'How long have you known?' And when I told her 3 weeks, she cried a little. Not a lot, but a little." She wasn't surprised. Victoria's mouth tightened. "No, she said she'd noticed something off about Marcus 6 months ago, some change in his behavior, shorter temper. Arriving at the office early, leaving late. She thought it was a personal problem, a marriage thing," she said. She didn't want to interfere. A pause. "She blames herself. I told her not to. But you understand it. Completely. Because I've been doing the same thing in my head for 3 weeks. She looked down at the floor of the hardware aisle and then back up. "There's a version of a person you know, and then there's the person they actually are. And when those two things turn out to be different, you can't just delete the first version. It stays there. It argues with everything you find out." Ethan thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They stood for a moment in the unremarkable fluorescent light of the hardware store, and something passed between them that didn't require naming, the particular understanding of people who've had to rebuild their sense of someone, who know what it costs and how long it takes. "I'd like to meet Lily," Victoria said. It came out like it had been sitting behind her teeth for a while. "Why?" "Because she sounds like a person worth meeting." She paused. "And because she makes a distinction between nice and polite that I want to be evaluated on." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back, straightforward and a little nervous, which she was doing a controlled job of not showing. "Saturday," he said. "There's a market in Mill Haven, small one. Lily goes every week." She nodded. "I'll be there." "Bet." He told Lily Thursday evening. He framed it neutrally. A person he'd met, someone he'd had lunch with a couple times. She wanted to say hello. Lily was silent for a full 5 seconds, which for Lily was approximately equivalent to a geological era. "The bag lady?" she said. "I've relayed that you call her that." "Is she your girlfriend?" "No." "Are you going to make her your girlfriend?" "We've had lunch twice." "That's how it starts." She said this with the authority of someone who'd watched a great deal of television. "That's literally how every story starts." "Not every story. Most stories." "Lily, I'm just saying." She folded her arms with a kind of philosophical acceptance. "I'm not opposed. I'm just noting." "Noted." "She should know that I'm an important variable in this situation." "I believe she already does." Lily thought about this and seemed to find it acceptable. "Okay, Saturday." "Bad." Victoria showed up in jeans and a plain jacket and brought nothing, no flowers or gifts or any of the things people sometimes brought when they were trying to make a good impression on a child, and Ethan appreciated that without saying so. Lily's approach was methodical. She spent the first 20 minutes of the market essentially ignoring Victoria, moving through the stalls with her usual focused energy while Victoria walked alongside Ethan, and Ethan watched his daughter conduct what he recognized as a controlled assessment. Then Lily stopped at the honey stall, the one she always stopped at, and said to Victoria without looking at her, "Do you like honey?" "Depends on the honey," Victoria said. Lily turned. "What do you mean?" "Some honey tastes like flowers, some tastes like bark. The stuff from the high-altitude hives tastes like something I can't name." Lily's expression shifted. She pointed at the jar in front of her. "This one is from bees that mostly visit clover. The man told me." She paused. "What do you think clover honey tastes like?" "Polite," Victoria said. "Like it doesn't want to take over." Lily stared at her for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan, then back at Victoria. "That's actually exactly right." Ethan kept his face neutral. The morning opened up after that. Lily moved between English and the particular frequency of a 10-year-old who has decided someone is worth talking to, which was a significant step from someone she was merely tolerating. She explained the goat cheese situation in detail. She outlined her dog argument in full. Victoria listened, asked real questions, pushed back on exactly one point, the emotional loneliness of the Labrador, which she argued could not be proven without more data. And Lily responded to this with the delight of someone whose arguments were being taken seriously rather than managed. They found a picnic table near the edge of the market and ate. Victoria and Lily split a piece of blueberry pie with the focused cooperation of people who've already decided they're going to get along. Ethan sat back and watched them and felt something shift in him that he didn't have good language for. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt more like the end of a long-held breath. He didn't let himself stay in it for long. That was instinct. You recognized when something good was happening and you were careful with it, because careful was how you kept things. He'd learned that lesson and paid full price for it. But he sat in that moment for just a few seconds longer than he needed to. On the way back to the cars, Lily walked ahead with her market bag, and Victoria fell into step beside Ethan, and they walked in comfortable silence for a moment, and then she said quietly, "She's extraordinary." "She is," he said. No deflection, just the truth. "She looks like you around the eyes," Victoria said, "but she's nothing like you." "She's like her mother." Victoria nodded. She didn't say anything else, and he was grateful because there was nothing else to say about that, and she seemed to understand it. Waltz. The message from Diane came on a Monday. It was to Victoria first, who forwarded it to Ethan with 2 words above it. "It's worse." Diane had been going through the Foundation's communication archives, get a separate system from the financial records, email threads, and meeting notes, and board communications going back years. She'd found 3 separate chains in which Marcus Webb had corresponded with an outside party. Encrypted messages that the archive system had stored improperly, breaking part of the encryption. The outside party's identity was fragmented across the recovered messages, but the content was clear enough. Someone had hired Marcus, not recruited him gradually, not tempted him with opportunity over time. Someone had identified him, approached him, and given him a specific task. Redirect Foundation funds through channels that would be difficult to trace, hold them in the shell accounts, and wait. Wait for what wasn't specified in what Diane had recovered. But there was one additional detail in the correspondence. A name, not Marcus's handler, not the organization behind it, a name that appeared twice in passing reference, mentioned as if the person being discussed had no idea what was being arranged around them. Victoria's name. This wasn't fraud adjacent to the Foundation. This was something organized around Victoria specifically, a long-term setup using the Foundation as infrastructure, with Victoria as either the ultimate target or the ultimate cover. Ethan read the forwarded message twice. Then he called her. She picked up on the first ring. "You read it." "I did. I think I need to move faster than 3 weeks," she said. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was the particular steadiness of someone holding something very still because they're afraid of what happens if they put it down. "You need to move now," he said. "Today, Victoria." "I know." A pause. "I'm scared." "You should be." That's the right response. He stood up from the kitchen table and moved to the window, looking out at the driveway at the ordinary trees. "Do you have a lawyer you trust outside the Foundation?" "Yes." "Call them first, tonight, before you contact the FBI, get a lawyer on record. Then you make the call together." "Okay." He could hear her breathing. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Whatever this is, whoever is behind it, they've been watching the Foundation for a long time. That means they've been watching me." She paused. "And anyone connected to me." He already knew what she was going to say, but he let her say it. "Lily," she said. "I'm worried about Lily." He stood at the window with the phone to his ear, and outside the evening was the same Vermont evening it had been every evening for 4 years. Exactly the same, quiet and unchanged, and he looked at it and recognized that it wasn't going to stay that way. "I know," he said. He stayed on the phone with her for another 20 minutes. They made a plan, not a complete one, not an elegant one, just the next necessary steps mapped out in sequence the way you did when you didn't have time for a better plan. Lawyer tonight, FBI tomorrow morning, Diane to preserve and back up everything she'd found. When he hung up, he sat for a long moment. Then he stood up and went upstairs and checked on Lily, who was asleep with her arm hanging off the bed again, mouth slightly open, completely untroubled. He stood in her doorway. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there for a while, looking at his daughter in the dark. The thing about protecting something was that the hardest part was never the threat itself. The hardest part was the period just before, when you could see it coming and the distance was closing and everything you'd built was still intact, but you already knew it was about to be tested. He'd been in that space before, not with a daughter, not with these particular stakes, but the feeling was recognizable. He went back downstairs, he checked the locks. He sat at the kitchen table and thought carefully about everything he knew, everything Victoria had told him, every detail of what Diane had found. And he built a picture of it in his mind the way he used to build a picture of a surgical case. The anatomy of the problem, the layers, the critical structures, what had to be protected, what could be sacrificed, and in what order. Outside, a car passed on the road at the edge of his property, moving slow. He watched the headlights sweep across the front window and disappear. He didn't move for a long time after that. Victoria's lawyer was a woman named Carla Reyes, and from what Ethan could gather from the phone call Victoria relayed to him the following morning, Carla Reyes was the kind of attorney who asked exactly 3 questions before telling you what you needed to do and didn't soften any of it. The 3 questions, as Victoria reported them. How long have you had this information? Who else has seen it? Have you touched anything in the original files? 3 weeks. Diane. You should have called me the day you found it, but we're not going to spend time on that. Call no one else before the FBI. I mean, no one. Not your board, not your PR team, not Marcus himself. You give him any warning, and the first thing he does is make you the problem. Are we clear? They were clear. The FBI field office in Burlington took the initial call at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. By noon, 2 agents had arrived at Victoria's private office, not the foundation's main building, a separate space she used for personal business, and spent 3 hours with her and Carla reviewing everything Victoria and Diane had compiled. Ethan wasn't there for any of it. He was at the clinic, seeing patients, operating on a Tuesday schedule that had no room in it for the fact that somewhere across the city a conversation was happening that would determine whether the last several weeks of his life had been building towards something manageable or something else entirely. He got a text from Victoria at 2:47. They're taking it seriously. That's all I can say right now. Are you free tonight? He was not free tonight in the conventional sense. He had Lily and dinner and the ordinary Tuesday structure of their life. He texted back, "Come here, I'll make dinner." A pause. Then, "Are you sure?" "Yes." Come out. She arrived at 6:30, which was a version of herself he hadn't seen before. The composed professional face had been replaced by something rawer, more tired, the kind of face a person wore when they'd spent a day being very careful and now they were somewhere they didn't have to be. Lily was at the kitchen table with homework, and she looked up when Victoria came in and said, "Hi," with the easy familiarity of someone who had already made her assessment and didn't need to repeat it. Victoria said, "Hi, Lily," with a warmth that was slightly unguarded, and Ethan noticed the slight unguard and filed it somewhere. He'd made something simple, roast chicken and vegetables, the kind of dinner that cooked itself while you did other things and that filled a house with a smell that was straightforwardly comforting. Victoria sat at the kitchen table while he finished, and Lily showed her a math problem she didn't understand. And Ethan listened from the counter as Victoria worked through it with her in a way that was direct and patient and didn't talk down, and by the end Lily had gotten it and was ostentatiously unsurprised, because she was Lily. They ate. The conversation stayed in safe territory. Lily's school, a film she'd seen on the weekend, the ongoing Labrador situation, which Victoria had updated opinions on now that she'd met the dog in question through Lily's photo documentation. After dinner, Ethan got Lily to bed. When he came back downstairs, Victoria was at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her do an ordinary thing in his ordinary kitchen and felt the complicated quality of that. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She kept washing. "What did the FBI say?" he asked, coming to stand beside her with a dish towel. They already knew about the shell companies. She handed him a plate to dry. "Not from our evidence. They'd been watching a separate money laundering network for 8 months, and 2 of the accounts I found overlap with what they were already tracking. Ours was a piece they'd been missing. So this is bigger than Marcus. Much bigger." She handed him another plate, and her hand wasn't entirely steady. "Marcus isn't the architect. He's a mechanism. Someone recruited him. Someone with enough reach that the FBI has been chasing them through 3 states and hasn't been able to bring charges." She stopped washing and gripped the edge of the sink. "My foundation wasn't the only vehicle. There are at least 2 other nonprofits that got hit the same way. Same structure, same shell company pattern. We're the biggest, which is why I got the version of Marcus that was apparently the most trusted." Ethan set down the towel. "Did they say who's behind it?" "They said they can't share that." Her knuckles were white against the sink. "But one of the agents, not the senior one, the younger one, when Carla stepped out to take a call, he said something to me. He said you need to be careful about your public calendar for the next few weeks. Limit the predictable routines." And then he stopped talking when Carla came back. Ethan thought about this. "They think someone's watching you." "I think they know someone's watching me." She turned to look at him. Her face was very controlled and very frightened simultaneously, which was a specific combination he recognized from people who'd spent time in high-stakes situations and knew that falling apart wasn't an option, but couldn't fully prevent the fear from surfacing anyway. "Ethan, if they know I went to the FBI, what does your calendar look like this week?" She blinked at the shift to practical. "Foundation board meeting Wednesday. A donor event Thursday evening. A site visit Friday morning. Cancel Thursday. Reschedule Wednesday to a location you haven't used before. The site visit, he thought about it. Take different routes. Not the same car 2 days running if you can help it. She was watching him. You've done this before. Something like it. He picked up the dish towel again. Different circumstances, same basic principle, so you limit predictability and you make sure someone you trust always knows where you are. I told Carla I'd check in twice a day. Good. Who else? Diane. Add me, he said. Not an offer, just a statement. She looked at him for a long moment. Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read, and she looked away before he could try. Okay, she said. Wednesday came and went without incident. Thursday came and went. Victoria canceled the donor event with a plausible excuse and spent the evening at the foundation office going through files with Diane, both of them compiling documentation for the FBI's second meeting, which was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Ethan talked to her both days, morning and evening. Brief calls, practical. Where are you? Where are you going next? Who knows your schedule? She responded to the structure of it with the same pragmatic acceptance she brought to most things, and he could tell she found it both frustrating and reassuring, which seemed about right. On Friday morning, he dropped Lily at school. He was back home by 8:15, working through chart notes at the kitchen table, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. The voice was male, careful, the kind of careful that wasn't natural but had been practiced into sounding natural. Dr. Carter, we'd like to ask you to step back from your current involvement with Ms. Sterling's situation. This is a friendly suggestion. Ethan sat very still. Who is this? Someone with an interest in how this resolves. You've been helpful to her, I understand that, but the conversation she's been having with federal authorities has the potential to create complications that extend well beyond your clinic in Millhaven. A pause. And beyond your daughter's school. He kept his voice level. The way he had in operating rooms when things started going wrong. Not flat, not without feeling, just not letting the feeling drive. Is that a threat? It's a clarification of how complex this situation is. You're a reasonable man, Dr. Carter, a good father. I don't think you need complications. I think you need to be very careful about the next thing you say. A brief silence. That's your choice. I hope it's the right one. The line went dead. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for approximately 4 seconds. Then he called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. I was just about to call you. I got a call, he said. Male voice. They mentioned Lily's school. He heard her breath stop. Ethan, I'm going to get her. I'm pulling her out of school today. He was already standing, moving toward the coat rack. Call your agent, not the younger one, the senior one. Tell them about this call and tell them it's escalated to direct contact. I'm calling right now. Ethan, I'm so sorry. This is because of me. We're not doing that right now. He had his keys. He was at the door. Call the agent. Tell Diane to get out of the office. Not permanently, just today. Go somewhere public and crowded. I'll call you when I have Lily. He drove to the school. He kept his speed at the legal limit because drawing any attention was exactly the wrong thing to do. And he focused on the road and the distance between himself and his daughter and didn't let his mind go anywhere outside of that. Lily's school was a low brick building on the edge of town. He walked into the office, explained there was a family situation without elaborating, and signed the early dismissal form while the office manager, a woman he'd known for 3 years, gave him the particular look that people gave when they understood something was wrong and were deciding whether to ask. He smiled at her in a way that said, I've got it. And she seemed to accept that. Lily was waiting in the hallway 2 minutes later with her backpack and an expression that combined genuine concern with something that looked very faintly like the excitement of an unusual day. What happened? She asked. Nothing specific. I just need you with me today. She studied him. She had her mother's ability to read the difference between nothing specific, meaning actually nothing, and nothing specific, meaning something that wasn't being fully named. Is Victoria okay? She's handling something. I'll explain what I can when I can. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she fell into step beside him and didn't push further, which told him she understood more than he'd said, and he was simultaneously grateful for her intelligence and aware of the sharp particular guilt of a parent who has let their child come close enough to something dangerous to sense it. He drove to the home of his neighbor, Frank Gallo, 63 years old, retired state trooper, a man who had helped Ethan shovel his driveway twice, and whose fundamental trustworthiness Ethan had assessed over 4 years to be essentially absolute. Frank opened the door and read Ethan's face in about 2 seconds. "What do you need?" "I need Lily with you for today. Possibly tonight." "Done." He didn't ask questions in front of Lily, which confirmed everything Ethan had already assessed about him. Lily looked at Ethan. "Where are you going?" "I need to be somewhere for a few hours." He crouched to her level, which he didn't do often anymore because she was almost too old for it, and she seemed to register the significance of the gesture. "Frank has satellite TV, and I believe he has frozen waffles." "I do have frozen waffles," Frank confirmed. "I'll be back tonight," Ethan said. "If anything feels wrong at all, anything. You tell Frank and he calls me. Okay?" Lily looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard not to be scared. "Okay," she said. He hugged her. She held on for a moment longer than usual, which she would never in normal circumstances acknowledge. He straightened up. Frank met his eyes and nodded once, and that was the whole conversation. He drove to Burlington. Victoria's private office was on the 4th floor of a building on Church Street, accessible through a side entrance, and he'd been there once before when they'd met briefly to exchange documents Diane had printed. He called Victoria from the parking structure 2 blocks away. "I'm outside," he said. "What? Why are you here?" "Because your FBI meeting is in 3 hours and you shouldn't be in that building alone." A pause. "Ethan, you don't have to—" "Victoria." A longer pause. "Side entrance. I'll buzz you up." She was in a large open office that held 2 workstations, a wall of filing cabinets, and a conference table covered in organized stacks of documents. Diane was there, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, who looked at Ethan with the particular expression of someone who has recently been through a great deal and is managing it through forward motion. "Diane," he said. "You're the one from the farmer's market," she said. "That's me." "Good," she said simply, and went back to the document she was annotating. Victoria looked at him from across the conference table. She was wearing the same composed face she'd had in her waiting room the first time he saw her, the practiced surface, but underneath it something had shifted. The tiredness from dinner at his house was still there, and now there was something additional, a kind of coiled alertness, like someone who'd stopped sleeping well and had converted the sleeplessness into focus. "How's Lily?" she asked. "Safe. With someone I trust. I've been thinking about what you said, about the call." She pressed both hands flat on the table. "They wouldn't threaten a child unless they were running out of moves, or to signal they're willing to." "Same thing." She looked at him. "Marcus is in the building. His office is 2 floors up. He doesn't know what's been compiled as far as we know, but if whoever contacted you has a way into his ear. Does the FBI know he's in the building today?" "I told Agent Rourke this morning." She hesitated. "He said, don't do anything to alert Marcus. Don't change your behavior in any way he might notice." Ethan looked at the table, at the stacks of evidence. "How complete is all this?" Diane answered before Victoria could. "Complete enough. We have 12 transactions totaling $6.3 million. We have Marcus's authorization on everyone. We have the recovered message fragments linking the shell accounts to an outside party. And we have this." She picked up a folder and handed it across the table to Ethan. "Found it last night in a backup archive. A full communication chain, only partially encrypted." He opened the folder. The documents were printed copies of what appeared to be email threads. Not all of them legible, but enough. He read carefully. The outside party had a name in these communications, not a full name, a set of initials that appeared in 3 places. RV. The communications referenced dates, transfer amounts, and a deadline. A specific date, 6 weeks away, by which certain accounts needed to be liquidated and funds moved to a final destination. The destination was listed as a single line, offshore holding per prior arrangement. 6 weeks from when? Ethan asked. From 2 weeks ago, Diane said. So they have 4 weeks left. That's why the pace changed, Victoria said. That's why the phone calls, why they contacted you. We got too close too quickly for their timeline. Ethan set the folder down. He looked across the table at Victoria and thought about the conversation he'd had 4 weeks ago with a woman in a hardware store aisle who'd said, I think I need 2 more weeks, and about how different the geometry of a situation looked when you were standing inside it versus looking at it from the outside. They were inside it now. There's something else, Victoria said. Her voice had dropped slightly. I didn't want to tell you over the phone. She paused. RV. The initials in the communications. Carla ran them against every individual with a board connection to any organization in the Foundation's network. She came up with one strong match. A beat. Roland Vance. He runs a private equity group out of New York. He's been a donor to the Foundation for 4 years. You know him? I've met him twice. Formal events. He was... She stopped, pressed her lips together. He was perfectly pleasant, professional, generous, apparently. Her voice had a dry, bitter edge on that last word. He was also in the room at the gala 18 months ago, where Marcus and I publicly announced the Foundation's rural health expansion, the largest single grant package we'd ever assembled, $40 million. She looked at him steadily. I think that's when he identified the opportunity. The size of the disbursement, the internal trust we had in Marcus, the timeline. She paused. 4 years of donations, and he was building access the whole time. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it took to plan something that carefully over that long. The patience of it. The particular character of a person who could sit across a dinner table from someone they intended to destroy and maintain a perfectly pleasant professional manner. The FBI knows about Vance? He asked. Carla gave them his name this morning. That's what changed the tone of the meeting. I could hear it, the way the senior agent's voice shifted. She pushed back from the table and stood up, kneading the movement. I think they know who he is already. I think they've known for longer than they told me. Outside the windows of the 4th-floor office, Burlington went about its business. A delivery truck moved down the street below. A couple stood on the corner looking at their phones. Everything ordinary from up here, which was one of the ways the world deceived you. It kept looking the same regardless of what was operating inside it. Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Frank Gallo. He answered immediately. Everything's fine, Frank said before Ethan could speak. Lily's good. She's watching TV and eating waffles with alarming enthusiasm. A pause. But there's a car on your street, Ethan. Dark sedan been parked at the end of your road for about 40 minutes. I drove past it on a walk. Plates aren't local. Ethan looked up at Victoria. Frank. He kept his voice even. Go back inside. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or a uniformed officer with a badge you can verify through the window. Already done, Frank said. I'm a retired trooper, son. I've got this. I know. Thank you. He ended the call. Diane was looking at him. Victoria was already reaching for her phone. Call Rourke, Ethan said. Right now. Tell him about the car and give him Frank's address. He thought for 1 second. And tell him Marcus Webb is upstairs. He watched Victoria make the call, watched her give Rourke the information in clipped, precise sentences, watched the controlled surface of her hold, while underneath it he could see the toll this was taking, the cumulative weight of weeks of fear managed through competence and forward motion. When she hung up, she stood with the phone in both hands and said, He said don't leave the building. He said they're sending someone to the Millhaven address and someone here. Good. He also said... She stopped. Swallowed. He said Marcus Webb left the building 20 minutes ago. Security footage has him in the parking structure. Diane set down her pen. The three of them stood in the quiet of the office, and the implications of that settled in the way bad news did. Not all at once, but in layers, each layer slightly worse than the one before it. If Marcus knew, then Vance knew. If Vance knew, the timeline had collapsed from 4 weeks to hours. Every account they hadn't yet traced would be moving right now. Every loose end being dealt with by people whose resources Ethan didn't have full measure of. The backup copies, he said to Diane. Where are they? 3 places, encrypted cloud storage. a physical drive in my apartment, and she reached into her jacket pocket and held up a small drive. Here, not a bag, not a desk, your hand to theirs. Understood. He looked at Victoria. She was looking back at him with an expression that contained too many things to separate: fear and exhaustion, and something that looked, beneath all of it, like trust. The specific trust of someone who has run out of ways to handle a situation alone and has decided, not by default, but by genuine assessment, that the person standing across from them is the right one to trust. He'd operated at this level of stakes before. Different room, different threat, different everything about the circumstances. But the core of it was the same. The moment when the situation simplified because there were no more options to evaluate and only one clear thing left to do. "We stay in this room," he said. "Both of you. Until Rourke's people are in this building." "And then?" Victoria asked. "And then we give them everything and let them do their jobs." He paused. "And you don't go back to your apartment tonight." She looked at him. "Where do I go?" He'd already thought about it. "Millhaven, you stay with us." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Ethan, you'd be doing the same thing if it were reversed, and you know it." She was quiet for a beat. Outside, a siren rose somewhere to the south and then faded. The city kept moving in its ordinary way, oblivious. "Okay," she said. They waited. Ethan stood near the window where he could see the street below without being visible from outside. And he thought about the fact that 4 weeks ago he'd been sitting at a farmer's market with cold coffee, watching his daughter interrogate a tomato vendor, and the distance between that Saturday morning and this Friday afternoon was so short in calendar terms and so long in every other way that it seemed to belong to a different story entirely. 38 minutes later, 2 federal agents came through the door. Rourke was one of them, a solid man in his late 40s with the kind of face that had been professionally neutral for so long it had become his default expression. He looked at the 3 of them, looked at the table of documents, looked at Diane's hand holding the drive. "Ms. Nguyen," he said to Diane, "I'll take that." She placed it in his hand. He closed his fist around it. "We have a team at the Millhaven address," he said to Ethan. "Your daughter is fine. The vehicle on the street is registered to a security firm with ties to Roland Vance's holding company. The people in it are in custody." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't fully acknowledged he'd been holding. "Marcus Webb?" Victoria asked. Rourke looked at her without expression. "We're handling that." She nodded. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright, and she held herself very still, the way someone held themselves when they didn't trust what would happen if they relaxed. Ethan crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching, just beside her, near enough that she could feel he was there. She didn't look at him, but she let out a long, slow breath, and her shoulders came down half an inch, and that was enough. They drove to Millhaven together in Ethan's truck. Victoria was in the passenger seat, and she looked out the window at the Vermont countryside going gold and dark in the late afternoon, and she didn't say anything for most of the drive, and he didn't push her. About 10 minutes from Millhaven, she said, "I keep thinking about the first time I met Marcus. He was recommended by a colleague I trusted completely. He came into my office and shook my hand and told me he believed in what I was building, and I—" She stopped, looked out the window. "I believed him. For 8 years I believed him. He may have believed it himself once. That almost makes it worse." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They pulled into Frank's driveway. The lights were on inside, warm against the beginning dark. Before he could get out of the truck, Lily appeared at the front door and then came down the steps at the kind of speed that communicated more than she intended, and Ethan caught her at the bottom. She held on hard, the way she had in the school hallway, the way she did when she was trying not to admit she'd been scared. He held on longer. Over the top of her head, he saw Victoria standing a few feet away, watching them, and on her face was an expression so unguarded he had to look away from it to give her the privacy of it. "Come on," he said to Lily eventually, setting her back. "Let's go home." Lily looked at Victoria. Something passed between them in the quick, instinctive way of a child and an adult who have already decided what they are to each other. Lily stepped sideways and took Victoria's hand without ceremony, the way she might have taken Ethan's. Victoria looked down at her hand held by a 10-year-old's small grip. She didn't say anything. She just walked. The three of them went home in the early dark, through the front door, into the lit and ordinary warmth of a house that had, until this morning, been just two people's home. It felt different with three. Ethan noticed it before he could decide how he felt about it. He let them inside and locked the door behind them and stood in his kitchen and started making dinner. And behind him he could hear Lily telling Victoria about the frozen waffles and Frank's satellite TV, her voice carrying the particular relief of a child who has been scared and is now covering it with chatter, and Victoria's responses, quiet and warm and present. He kept his hands busy. He didn't look at them, but he listened, and the listening felt like something. Victoria slept in his guest room. Ethan knew this because he heard her moving at 2 a.m. Not restless movement, purposeful movement. The sound of someone who'd given up on sleep and was trying to be quiet about it. He lay in his own bed and listened for a few minutes, and then got up. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, a cup of tea going cold beside her. She looked up when he came in without surprise, which meant she'd heard him too. "You should sleep," he said. "I know." She looked back at the screen. "I keep running through the timeline, trying to find the thing I missed that would have moved us faster." He sat down across from her. "You'd have found it the same time you found it. That's how it works." "I knew Marcus for 8 years. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's a failure of his character." He paused. "You can't fact-check a person continuously for 8 years. You'd never do anything else." She was quiet for a moment. Carla called at midnight. Marcus's attorney reached out to federal prosecutors. He's cooperating. Ethan absorbed this. In exchange for what? Reduced charges. He's giving them everything on Vance. Wire transfers, correspondence, instructions, everything he's held on to. She closed the laptop. He apparently had a folder of documentation going back 3 years. His own protection, if it ever went wrong. A pause. "It went wrong." 3 years of holding that, Ethan said. "I keep trying to figure out what that was like. Knowing what you're doing, coming to work every day, having lunch with colleagues, looking me in the eye." She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. "I don't understand it." Some people build a compartment for it, keep the two things separate. It doesn't mean the thing they're hiding doesn't exist. It means they've gotten very practiced at not looking at it. She looked at him with the expression she had sometimes, the one that was taking in more than the words. "You've seen that before." "In medicine, yeah. People living with something they won't name. It has a cost. It always has a cost." He looked at the cold tea. "Go to bed, Victoria." She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're very direct for 3 a.m. I'm direct at all hours. You've met me." She looked at him across the table. The kitchen was quiet and the light above the stove was the only one on. And in that low light she looked less composed and more real. The particular realness of a person seen without the performance they didn't know they were giving. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For all of it. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm saying it." She held his gaze. "I've been around people for most of my adult life who do things because they're calculating what it returns. You're not doing that, and I'm aware of how unusual that is, and I don't want to not say so." He didn't have a response to that. Not one he was prepared to say at 3 a.m. in his own kitchen. "Get some sleep," he said. She closed the laptop and picked up the cold cup of tea and went upstairs, and Ethan sat alone for a while in the quiet of the house before going back to bed himself. Work called at 7:45 the next morning. Ethan was making eggs. Lily was eating cereal with the particular deliberate focus of someone pretending not to listen to adult conversation. Victoria was at the table with coffee, still in the clothes she'd slept in, which was a pair of Ethan's sweatpants she'd borrowed and a shirt she'd had in her bag, and she looked more rested than 3 a.m. had suggested she'd manage. Rourke's call was concise, which Ethan had come to understand was his default mode. 3 things. Marcus Webb's cooperation had been formally accepted. Federal prosecutors were moving on Roland Vance within the next 24 to 48 hours. And the 2 men who'd been in the vehicle outside Frank Gallo's address were cooperating separately, providing additional corroborating information about Vance's operation. "The situation for Ms. Sterling and yourself is significantly lower risk than it was yesterday," Rourke said. "I wouldn't call it zero risk until Vance is in custody, but significantly lower." "How long until you have him?" I can't give you a timeline, but the warrant has been issued. A pause. He's in the country. We know where he is. Ethan thanked him and put the phone down. He looked at Victoria. You heard? He said. Most of it. She was holding her coffee with both hands. Lower risk. Not zero. He said that too. Lily said without looking up from her cereal, What does lower risk mean? Ethan looked at his daughter. He'd had the conversation with her the previous evening. A version of it calibrated to what a 10-year-old needed to understand without what a 10-year-old didn't need to carry. She'd listened with the same focused attention she brought to things she'd decided were important, asked 2 questions, and then said she wanted to make sure Victoria knew she could stay as long as she needed to. It means the people causing problems are being handled, he said. Lily nodded. Then she looked at Victoria. Are you scared? A little, Victoria said. Less than yesterday. That's good trajectory. Lily said this seriously. Then she stood up and put her bowl in the sink and shouldered her backpack. I have school. I know, Ethan said. Is it safe? He looked at her. Yes. Rourke's people will have someone near the school today. She accepted this with a nod. Then she paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at Victoria. You should stay for dinner again. Dad makes real food on Fridays, but the rest of the week is also fine. Victoria smiled. The full one, the unguarded one. I'd like that. Lily went to school. Quote, the day moved slowly, the way days did when you were waiting on something you couldn't control. Victoria spent most of it on the phone, with Carla, with Diane, with the foundation's board chairman, who'd been formally notified at 8 that morning and who, from the half of the conversation Ethan caught, appeared to be handling it with the particular stunned pragmatism of someone who'd been handed terrible news and had decided that having feelings about it was a problem for later. Ethan worked from home. Chart notes, a telehealth call, administrative things that occupied his hands without fully occupying his mind. He was aware of Victoria's presence in the house in the way you were aware of a change in a familiar room. Not intrusive, just different. She worked at the kitchen table and he worked in his office, and they passed each other in the hallway, in the kitchen with the ease of 2 people who hadn't discussed whether they were comfortable with this arrangement because neither of them particularly needed to. At noon, she appeared in his office doorway with 2 sandwiches and set one on his desk without comment. You didn't have to, he started. You have food, she said. It was going to go to waste. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at his desk, which was its usual organized chaos of files and Lily's drawings and the Father's Day plant, still thriving against all expectation. What's the surgery book? She was looking at a textbook on the corner of the shelf, spine worn. Bailey and Love's, surgical reference. I keep it out of habit. She studied it. Do you read it? Sometimes, when I can't sleep. Like reading the manual of a car you no longer own. He looked at her. That's actually exactly what it's like. She nodded slowly, and he could see her filing that, putting it somewhere alongside the other things she'd collected about him. He found he didn't mind. Being known, carefully and without pressure, it turned out he'd missed that. Carla thinks Marcus will testify, she said, if it goes to trial. Does that change anything for you? It means I'll have to be in the same room as him. She said it without visible emotion, which he was beginning to understand meant the emotion was there and being managed rather than absent. I keep thinking about his kids. His daughter's 13. She's probably... She stopped. That's not my problem to solve. It's still okay to think about. Is it useful to think about? Not particularly, but useful isn't the only category. She looked at him for a moment and the corner of her mouth moved. Eat your sandwich, she said, and went back to the kitchen. Rourke called again at 4:27. Roland Vance was taken into custody at 11 this morning in New York City. The senior agent's voice had, beneath the professional neutral, a quality Ethan recognized as satisfaction tightly controlled. He was attempting to board a private flight. We had assets at the airport. Ethan stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and felt the pressure of the last 3 weeks' release in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not all at once, not dramatically, but like a rope under enormous tension that has finally, slowly, been let slack. It's done, he said. The immediate threat is done. There will be a legal process that Ms. Sterling will need to be involved in. We'll need both of you for statements, but the people who represented a threat to you and your daughter are in federal custody. Thank you, Agent Rourke. Thank the doctor who told a woman to call her lawyer the night before she was going to wait another 2 weeks. A pause that contained something almost like humor. We'd have gotten there eventually. You made it faster. He put the phone down. He turned around. Victoria was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard it, the shape of it at minimum, enough to know from his face what it meant. He said, "Vance is in custody." She stood very still. Something crossed her face that was difficult to describe, the particular expression of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that the news that the impact isn't coming doesn't immediately compute. Relief and disbelief, and the beginning of something much larger sitting behind both of those. Then she put her hand over her mouth and sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, not in collapse, just sat down, like her legs had made a decision without consulting the rest of her, and pressed her back against the cabinet and breathed. Ethan sat down on the floor next to her, which probably wasn't what she'd expected, because she looked at him sideways with wet eyes and an expression that was almost confusion. "You didn't have to," she started. "I know." He leaned his back against the cabinet beside her. "It's a good floor." She looked at the ceiling and exhaled in a long, shaking breath. And then she laughed, abrupt and short and real, and pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. They sat on the kitchen floor for a while. The house was quiet around them. Outside, the Vermont afternoon was doing what Vermont afternoons did, going gold and unhurried toward evening, and neither of them moved for longer than was strictly necessary. When Ethan picked up Lily from school, she knew immediately. She read it in his posture before he said a word, the way she had her mother's ability to read the body language of people she cared about without being taught to. She stopped on the sidewalk outside the school and looked at him. "It's okay now," she said. Not a question. "Getting there," he said. "Yeah." She nodded in the way she had that was very old for 10. Then she put her backpack on both shoulders and fell into step beside him. "Is Victoria still at the house?" "She is." "Good." She paused. "Dad." "Yeah." "I like her." She said it with the straightforward simplicity of someone who had assessed the situation fully and was reporting her findings. Not just polite like. Actually like. Ethan kept walking. "I know." "Okay." She seemed satisfied with that. There was a dinner that evening. Not planned, not formal. Something that assembled itself out of the ingredients in the refrigerator and the fact of 3 people who were still running on the adrenaline residue of a difficult day and needed the grounding of an ordinary thing. Lily helped, which in practice meant she narrated what she believed the correct procedure was for each step, and occasionally did something useful. Victoria found the experience apparently fascinating. She stood at the counter and watched Lily direct Ethan through the correct ratio of butter to garlic, with the expression of someone who had been to many formal dinners and never quite had this. "The garlic goes in first," Lily said, "then the butter." "That's backwards," Ethan said. "No, I watched a video." "A video of what?" "Cooking." "Lily, butter burns at high heat. The video said garlic first." "The video was wrong." Lily considered this. "What if the video was right and you're wrong? Then dinner will taste like burnt garlic butter." "Which honestly sounds fine," Victoria said from the counter. "I have to say the video argument is technically ongoing." Ethan looked at her. "You're not helping." "I'm observing." The corners of her eyes were creased. Dinner was, despite the garlic debate, good. They ate at the kitchen table and the conversation went wherever Lily decided to take it, which was several places, including a detailed account of something that had happened at school involving a science project and a container of yogurt and a chain of events that Ethan could not entirely follow, but that Victoria appeared to follow perfectly, responding at the right moments, asking the right follow-up questions, her whole body turned toward Lily with the genuine attention of someone who was not performing interest. He watched this while pretending not to. His daughter with this woman. The way Lily leaned slightly toward Victoria without noticing she did it. The way Victoria's guard, which was usually a constant low presence, even in relaxed moments, simply wasn't there. He thought about the floor of his kitchen that afternoon. He thought about Victoria's hand over her mouth, and the relief on her face, and the fact that she'd sat down where she was because it was where her body took her when the thing holding her up finally eased. He thought about what it meant that she'd sat down in his kitchen. Not a hotel. Not her own apartment. Here. He didn't follow that thought all the way to its end, not yet. There was still too much happening. The legal process Rourke had mentioned, the work that Victoria had ahead of her with the foundation, the weeks of aftermath that always followed something like this. This wasn't the moment for anything except getting through the next necessary thing, but he held the shape of the thought without letting it go entirely. After dinner, Lily announced she was going to read in her room, which was her way of giving adults space without saying so, and Ethan suspected she'd developed this particular skill recently and was slightly unsettled by how sophisticated it was. He and Victoria stood at the sink washing dishes again. The repetition of it didn't escape him, and the kitchen was quiet except for the water and the ordinary sounds of the house. "I need to go back to Burlington tomorrow," she said. "There's a board meeting. They need to see me in the room." "I know. I'll be okay. Carla will be there. Diane." She handed him a plate. "And the people who were the actual problem are in custody. Still, keep Rourke's number." "Already in my phone." A pause. "Ethan." He looked at her. She was looking at the water running over her hands, not at him. When the legal part is finished and the foundation is stable again." She stopped. Started again. "I don't know what this is, what we are. I'm aware that most of the time we've spent together in the last month has been in crisis conditions, and that's not—" She stopped again. "Not a great baseline," he said. "No." She finally looked at him. "But I also don't think crisis conditions manufactured whatever this is. I think they just moved it faster than it would have moved on its own." She held his gaze. "Yes." He was aware that his heart rate had changed, which was information. He was also aware that he hadn't let himself notice how he felt about Victoria Sterling. Not fully, not directly. He'd looked at it sideways and kept moving, the way you kept moving through a difficult stretch because stopping to assess it cost more than you could afford while you were still in it. "Lily made her position clear this afternoon," he said. "What position?" "That she likes you, specifically, not just politely." Victoria looked at him. Something shifted in her face, open and carefully unguarded. "That means something," she said quietly. "It means a great deal." He paused. "She doesn't say it about people she doesn't mean it about. Like her father." He didn't answer that directly, but he also didn't look away. They finished the dishes in silence, but it was the kind of silence that held more than talking did, and neither of them tried to fill it. She left the next morning at 7:30. Lily was already up and handed Victoria a piece of toast before she could protest, and Victoria ate it at the kitchen counter with her bag on her shoulder, and Lily sat across from her and briefed her on the board meeting with the confidence of someone who had attended many board meetings in her imagination. "The important thing," Lily said, "is to not let them see that you're nervous, because then they get nervous." "That's excellent advice," Victoria said. "Dad does it at the clinic. He said most of the time people just need to think someone knows what they're doing." Victoria glanced at Ethan. He shrugged. "She listens to everything." "Clearly." She finished the toast, picked up her bag, looked at Lily. "Thank you for the toast and the consulting services." "Any time," Lily said seriously. At the front door, Victoria paused. Ethan was leaning against the doorframe, and she looked at him with the particular directness she always brought, the quality that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her at the farmer's market, the look that didn't perform anything. "I'll call you after the meeting," she said. "I know." She hesitated for 1 second more, and then, without making anything of it, she put her hand briefly against his forearm, a light pressure, there and gone. Then she walked to her car. He stood in the doorway and watched her leave. Behind him, Lily said, "So?" "Don't," he said. "I'm just—" "Lily." A pause. Then, with theatrical innocence, "I just wanted a glass of water." He turned around. She was already at the kitchen tap, looking at the ceiling, the picture of someone who had absolutely nothing to say. He looked at his daughter and thought about the particular experience of being known by a 10-year-old who missed nothing and said everything. "School," he said. She went to get her backpack. He stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of his house in the morning, ordinary and intact, and thought about a woman driving down a Vermont road toward a city that still had complications waiting in it, and about the specific fact that he was going to hear from her tonight, and that he let himself know it plainly, standing in his own hallway, glad. The board meeting went for 4 hours. He knew this because Victoria sent him a text at the 2-hour mark that said only, "Still alive. Board is shell-shocked but functional." And then at the end, "Meeting over." Diane cried, "Good crying. I think we're going to be okay." He responded, "Good." She called at 9 that evening. Lily was in bed. He was on the back porch with a beer he'd barely touched, looking out at the lake, the last of the light going out of the sky in long horizontal layers. "How was it really?" he asked. "Hard." She sounded tired in a way that was cleaner than the tired of the last several weeks, a tired that came from doing difficult things, not from bracing for unknown ones. 3 board members want to bring in an external audit firm, which is absolutely the right call, and which I should have suggested first. Diane presented the documentation. There were questions I couldn't answer about Marcus, about how I didn't see it. A pause. I told them I didn't have a good answer for that. That's the honest answer. It's also the uncomfortable one. She paused again. One of the board members, Gordon, he's been there since the beginning. He said something at the end. He said the fact that the conspiracy required this level of sophistication over this length of time was evidence of how credible the Foundation's reputation was, that no one would have worked this hard to hide inside something nobody trusted. A beat. I'm not sure whether that made me feel better or worse. Both, probably. Yeah. He could hear her settling somewhere, the sound of cushions, a window. How's Lily? Asleep. She made me promise to report back on the board meeting. Tell her it went well. A small pause. Tell her the thing she said about not showing nerves was helpful. I thought of it right before I walked in. He looked out at the lake. The water was dark and still, and the sky above it had one bright low star, or maybe a planet, sitting right at the tree line. There's going to be a lot of legal process ahead of you, he said. Months of it, probably. She didn't sound frightened about it, which was different from 2 weeks ago. Carla is already building the case for the Foundation's civil claims. The federal prosecution of Vance will run on its own track. I'll probably have to testify. I'll probably have to testify, too, about the phone call. I know. I'm sorry about that. Don't be. He paused. I'm not. A silence that held something. Ethan, her voice was quieter. The program. The Rural Emergency Medical Initiative I've been thinking about for the last year. It was always going to happen, but after everything She stopped. I want to build it right. I want it to be something real. And I keep thinking, I keep coming back to you. Your experience. What you walked away from and what you kept. The kind of medicine you do now. A pause. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no obligation, and that I'm not asking because of anything except that I genuinely think you're the right person. Ask it. Would you be willing to help me design it? She said it carefully. Not run it, not leave your clinic. Just help me build it right from the beginning. You know what these communities need. You've been inside it for 4 years. He looked at the lake, the still water, the star at the tree line. He thought about the surgical textbook on his shelf and the answer he'd given her, like reading the manual of a car you no longer own. He thought about the young man who'd driven 40 minutes to see a doctor because there wasn't one closer. He thought about all the 40-minute drives, in every direction from every small town in Vermont, that people made because the geography of healthcare didn't reach where they lived. Yes, he said. He heard her exhale, long and slow and with something in it that wasn't just relief about the program. Okay, she said. Good. They talked for another hour, not about any of it, not the foundation or the legal process or the program. They talked about the things people talked about when the urgent things had been handled, and what was left was just the fact of 2 people who had found, through a set of circumstances neither of them would have chosen, that they wanted to keep talking. When he finally came inside, the house was quiet and dark except for the lamp in the house that had always been the right size for two people and was starting to feel, faintly, like it had been built for something else. He turned off the lamp. He went upstairs. He looked in on Lily, arm off the bed, mouth open, completely at peace, and he stood there the way he always did, just long enough to register it. Then he went to bed and for the first time in several weeks, slept without waking. The trial of Roland Vance began on a Tuesday in February, 8 months after a dark sedan sat at the end of a quiet road in Mill Haven, and two men watched a retired state trooper's house with the professional patience of people who had done that kind of work before. Vermont in February was the kind of cold that had no apology in it. Gray sky sitting low over the bare trees, the lake behind Ethan's house frozen to a matte white. The road into Burlington lined with the compressed dirty snow that accumulated at the shoulders in the second half of winter and didn't go anywhere until April decided to do something about it. Ethan drove that road on the first morning of the trial with his heater running and his coffee in the cup holder and the particular composure of a man who had been through a long preparation for something and was now simply in it. He'd given his statement to federal prosecutors in October. 3 hours in a conference room with 2 attorneys and a court reporter, walking through the timeline from the phone call at his kitchen table to the afternoon in Victoria's office to the call from Frank Gallo about the car on the road. He'd answered every question they asked and volunteered nothing beyond what was asked, which was Carla Reyes's instruction delivered through Victoria and which he followed because it was correct. Victoria had testified before the grand jury in November. She'd called him that evening from her apartment. She'd moved into a new one in October, smaller than the previous, in a building with better security. And she'd sounded flat in the specific way of someone who has used up their words for the day. He'd listened more than he'd talked, and that had seemed to be what she needed. The trial itself was expected to run 4 weeks. Ethan was scheduled to testify on the 9th day. In the meantime, he was present in the courthouse because Victoria had asked him to be, not in a way that required anything from him. She had Carla, she had Diane, she had the full apparatus of legal representation that her resources made available, but in the way a person asked for something when they didn't want to name what the something was. He understood that. He was there. The courtroom was larger than he'd expected and colder than was comfortable, the kind of institutional temperature that suggested either a broken thermostat or a philosophy about keeping everyone alert. He sat in the gallery beside Diane, who arrived every morning in a different blazer and with a thermos of coffee she shared without being asked. She was, Ethan had come to understand over the months since the crisis, a woman of enormous practical competence and almost no capacity for self-delusion, which made her good company. She slept 4 hours, Diane said on the 3rd morning without preamble, meaning Victoria. She tell you that? She texted me at 2:30 to ask if I'd saved a specific folder to the shared drive. She took a drink from her thermos. I told her yes, I'd saved it in September. Go to sleep. A pause. She said okay, and then sent me 3 more questions. Did you answer them? Of course I answered them. Diane's voice held the particular exasperation of someone who was exasperated entirely out of affection. She's been carrying this for almost a year. Answering her questions at 2:30 is the least difficult thing I've done. Ethan looked toward the front of the courtroom where Carla was arranging documents with the focused economy of someone who did not waste emotion. She's going to be fine. I know. Diane took another drink. She just needs to hear the verdict. After that, she'll sleep. He thought about that. The particular insomnia of waiting, not the functional alertness of a crisis, but the unresolvable state of a process that was in other people's hands. He'd known that feeling, in different rooms, at different tables. There was nothing to do with it except get through the time until it was over. What he hadn't entirely anticipated was Marcus Webb. Marcus took the stand on the 5th day. Ethan had constructed a version of him in his mind from the pieces Victoria had described, the 8 years of working beside her, the dinners, the children who called her by name, the man who had looked at a woman's trust and decided it was infrastructure. The version he'd built was somehow both entirely clear and not quite human. The way people you've never met but have reason to fear became abstracted into the shape of what they'd done. The man who sat in his witness box was 61 years old, gray at the temples, With the defeated posture of someone who had rehearsed his testimony so many times, it had become mechanical. He answered questions in the measured cadence of cooperation purchased at a price. Not remorse, not exactly, but a particular kind of self-awareness that came from having run all the alternative versions and finding that this was the one that cost the least. Ethan watched Victoria's face when Marcus walked in. She was sitting at the table beside Carla, and she did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the documents in front of her, and her expression carried nothing. Not rage, not grief, nothing. He knew her well enough now to know that the nothing was everything, and that maintaining it in that room with that man was costing her more than she would say to anyone afterward. Marcus testified for 2 days. His testimony was technically complete and humanly empty. Transaction numbers, authorization codes, communication records, the apparatus of the fraud laid out in careful sequence. He confirmed Vance's instructions. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed that the Foundation's rural health expansion announcement had been the event that crystallized the operation, that Vance had identified the size of that disbursement and the internal trust around it as the window they'd been waiting for. On the second afternoon, Carla cross-examined him. She was not theatrical about it. She didn't perform it for the gallery. She asked Marcus, in a quiet and entirely precise voice, whether he had understood, when he began routing the money, that the Foundation's programs would need to be reduced to cover the loss once it was discovered. He said yes. She asked whether he had been aware that the rural health program, specifically the program for underserved communities in Vermont and New Hampshire, was funded in part by the accounts he was diverting. He said yes. She asked whether he had ever, in the 2 years of the scheme, considered the people in those communities who would not receive services because the money had been moved. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I kept those things separate." Carla looked at him. "I know," she said, and sat down. Ethan heard Diane exhale quietly beside him. He looked at the back of Victoria's head, her spine straight, her hands flat on the table, still not looking at Marcus, not giving him her eyes, which was, he understood, the last boundary she'd decided to keep. Ethan testified on a Thursday. He sat in the witness box and answered questions for 90 minutes. He described the phone call in his kitchen, the voice, the phrasing, the reference to Lily's school. He described the afternoon in Victoria's office. He described Frank Gallo's call about the sedan. He answered the defense's cross-examination, which was brief and aimed mostly at establishing that he had no formal role in the investigation, which he confirmed without difficulty because it was true. When he was excused, he walked back through the gate and past the gallery and out the side door into the corridor, and Victoria was there. She'd stepped out during the recess. She looked at him. "Okay?" "Fine." He glanced back toward the courtroom doors. "You shouldn't be out here during testimony." Recess started 2 minutes ago. She had her arms folded across her chest, a posture he'd come to recognize as her version of self-containment. "I wanted to be here when you came out." He looked at her. 8 months had changed the surface of things. The crisis was over. The legal process had given their time together a different structure. The program they were building had given them a working relationship that was its own complicated territory. He had seen her in a dozen different states by now, frightened and composed and laughing and exhausted and direct in ways that still occasionally caught him off guard. What hadn't changed was the thing he'd noticed first in a hardware store aisle in Burlington. The absence of performance, the way she looked at him like she wasn't editing anything. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of it. You've said that before. It keeps being true." He looked at her for a moment. The courthouse corridor was empty, except for the two of them, linoleum floors and fluorescent light, and the distant sound of voices from a closed door somewhere down the hall. "I know," he said. She held his gaze a beat longer than the conversation required, which was a thing she did sometimes that he had learned to hold still for rather than deflect. Then Carla appeared through the courtroom door and said Victoria's name, and the moment ended the way moments did, cleanly, making room for the next thing. Done. Roland Vance was convicted on 11 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes, after the jury deliberated for 2 days and 4 hours. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon in late February. And when Carla leaned across and said the word guilty to Victoria in the gallery, something happened to Victoria's face that Ethan had never seen before. Not relief exactly, not trauma that had been held in compression for so long that its release looked almost like pain. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose for approximately 30 seconds, and Diane put her hand over Victoria's on the armrest, and that was the whole of it. Marcus Webb received his sentence 6 weeks later. Reduced charges, 8 years. The cooperative testimony factored in. The news came through Carla in a 2-line text that Victoria read in Ethan's kitchen on a Saturday morning and set her phone face down without comment. Ethan was at the counter. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "How do you feel about it?" She considered this genuinely, not performing the consideration. "I don't know yet." She looked at the phone on the table. "I think I'll feel something different in 6 months. Right now it just feels like a number." "That's a reasonable place to be." "I keep thinking about what I should feel. Like there's a correct response I'm not accessing." She looked up at him. "Is that strange?" "No, you spent 8 years building something with him. Whatever you feel about what he did, the 8 years were real. You can't just cancel them." She was quiet for a moment. "He sent a letter, through his attorney, an apology. Did you read it?" Carla read it. She said it was adequate. A pause. "I don't know if I'll ever read it. I don't think it would change anything." "It doesn't have to change anything to be worth reading eventually. That's your call, and whenever you make it is the right time." She looked at him across the kitchen. Morning light coming through the window, the ordinary Saturday sounds of Lily moving around upstairs. "You give very undramatic advice," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No." Something moved in her expression. "It's one of the things I—" She stopped. He waited. "One of the things I find most useful about you," she finished and looked back at her coffee. He understood she had been about to say something else, and that she'd redirected it. He let her redirect it. They were both very practiced at not pushing each other past where the other person was ready to go, which had turned out to be one of the things that made spending time with her easy, and also occasionally one of the things that made it difficult. The Rural Emergency Medical Initiative formally launched in April. Victoria announced it at a press conference that Ethan attended in a professional capacity and that he found genuinely uncomfortable. The cameras, the questions, the experience of standing at the edge of something public when his natural register was private. He answered 3 questions from journalists in the way he answered questions on the stand, accurately and without elaboration. Afterward, in the parking lot, Victoria found him. "You hate this part," she said. "I don't hate it." "You answered the reporter's 3rd question like you were testifying." "I was being precise." She smiled at him. She did that more than she had when they first met. Smiled at him with the relaxed ease of someone who had decided they were allowed to. "The program is real," she said. "Because of you. The program is real because you built it." "I built it with you." She paused. "Ethan, I want to say something and I'm going to say it without—" She stopped. Tried again. "Without redirecting it." He looked at her. She looked back. Spring in Burlington, April light, traffic sounds from the road 50 yards away. "I'm in love with you," she said. "I've been deciding whether to say that for about 3 months, and I'm saying it now because I think not saying it has gotten more complicated than saying it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware," she continued, with the quality of someone who had prepared for the possibility that the next few seconds might be uncomfortable, "that this is a parking lot." "It is a parking lot," he agreed, "and that the timing is—" "Victoria." She stopped. He looked at her. The direct, unself-conscious, absolutely unperformed face of the woman who had sat on his kitchen floor and slept in his guest room and built a program with him and eaten toast standing up in his kitchen while his daughter briefed her on board meetings. The woman who had looked at him at a farmer's market with the gap-seeking expression of someone trying to figure out what he was, and then had gradually, over months, stopped looking for the gap because she'd accepted there wasn't one. "I know," he said. "I've been less articulate about it." She looked at him. That's all you're going to say?" "I'm saying I know. I'm saying I've known." He paused. "I'm saying you're not alone in it." Something crossed her face, relief and exasperation and something tender underneath both. "You are the most infuriating," he laughed. He didn't do it often, the full version of it, but it came out whole and unguarded, and she blinked at it like she'd been handed something unexpected. "Come to dinner," he said. "Tonight. Lily's been working on her dog argument for a month, and I think she needs an audience." "That's what you're offering me." "It's what I have." She looked at him for a moment that stretched past the formal requirement of a moment. Then, "Okay," she said. May came in warm that year. The lake behind Ethan's house thawed in early April, and by May it was the flat, dark green particular color it took in warm weather, reflecting the sky and the tree line in a way that made the water and the air appear to be part of the same continuous thing. The program had its first field deployment in 3 rural counties by the end of April. Not full operations yet, a pilot running with 2 mobile medical units and 5 clinicians, one of whom Ethan had recruited from his clinic, and one of whom was a former Army medic he'd known for 15 years and called on the grounds that the work was the kind the man had been built for. The feedback from the first month was imperfect in the ways that first months always were. Logistics problems, one piece of equipment that had not survived transport, a communication gap between the mobile units and the county hospitals that needed a protocol built to fix it. Ethan spent 2 Saturday mornings building that protocol at the kitchen table while Victoria sat across from him working through donor reports, and Lily occupied the couch with a book she was only partially reading, her feet in Victoria's lap. The feet situation had developed gradually and without announcement. Lily had started sitting near Victoria sometime in February, then beside her, and at some point in March had simply put her feet on Victoria's legs during a movie, and Victoria had not moved, and that had been that. Ethan had observed the entire progression without comment, which was his standard approach to the things in his life that were going the right direction. On a Saturday morning in late May, Lily looked up from her book and said to Victoria, without preamble, "Are you going to live here?" Victoria lowered her report. Ethan kept his eyes on the protocol document. "I don't currently live here," Victoria said carefully. "I know. Are you going to?" "That's..." Victoria paused. "That's not something I've talked about with your dad." "Why not?" "Because these are conversations that adults have when they're ready to." Lily considered this with the judicious expression of someone who has a perspective on adult timelines and is deciding whether to express it. "I'm just asking because I want to know if I should stop putting my stuff in the guest room when I spread out." "You use the guest room for overflow?" "I have a lot of things." Lily returned to her book. "It would be easier to plan if I had information." Ethan set down his pen. "Lily." "I'm reading," she said, with